I will start with Kate. Kate Hartley. She's a public relation and crisis communication specialist. So we are going to speak theory. We are going to speak practical things and the world, what is the world doing. She is a consultant, trainer, author, and co-founder of Polpeo.com. We know that the salmonella outbreak, and we are speaking about COVID, but we didn't forget the salmonella. We should not convert avian influenza. So we have dramatic problems, dramatic climate changes, environment and anything. I will just be brief to say, should we use the social media? Should we use, what is the most important point? How can we communicate? How can we market our product? Kate will will outline the fundamental principles of a good crisis management. So Kate, I will give you the line.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can all hear me now, and we're not all hearing the additional audio that we could hear in the background. So thank you very much for your patience. I will share my screen now again. And start with a very quick introduction. I am Kate Hartley. I'm the co-founder of Polpeo, and we run crisis simulations for organisations all over the world, so that we mimic how a crisis might break on social media and traditional media, and that is in order to train people in how to communicate through a crisis situation. I'm also our trainer, so I train these teams all over the world. My background is in public relations and crisis communications, and I have recently published a book called Communicate in a Crisis that looks at the way people behave in a crisis, and that's really my main interest. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the core skills you need to communicate successfully through a crisis, and I'm going to start by looking a bit at how people behave in a crisis and why. I believe very strongly that if you understand why people behave the way they do, then you're better equipped to deal with that behaviour. But before we start, I want to define what I mean by a crisis. So this is how I define a crisis. It's something that threatens the ability of an organisation to operate normally. So it has the potential to have a really serious negative impact on your organisation or on your business, either damaging sales or your reputation, possibly your company valuation or even your share price. So in the worst cases, that might mean literally closing down an organization's operations through something like an environmental disaster, like a fire or a flood. It could mean the outbreak of a disease or infection, of course. It could be a deliberate hack, taking down a company's systems, or it could be a deliberate or reputational event that mean people lose confidence in buying from your organization or to stop trusting you. The one thing that is certain is that at some point we will all have to deal with a crisis. We know that now more than ever, whether it's a global pandemic and the resulting economic situation, or whether it's recalling a product because of contamination, or dealing with a change in political climate, for example, or a problem managing your supply chain, or dealing with activism. Crisis management is now part of every business's strategy. And the pandemic, of course, has thrown this really into sharp relief, and the importance of having good crisis plans. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody here how hard it has been to deal with changes in the market, shifts in demand, issues with economic volatility and staffing and supply chains, for example. But if you add to that the big social and environmental issues that we're facing, it creates an even more complicated environment. So in particular, things like climate change activism, human rights movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and the resulting pressure that is being put on governments and private organisations to be really transparent and accountable for their behaviour and their policies. And social media has really changed this environment. It's changed how people interact with organisations in a crisis situation. And we see unprecedented outrage on social media, which leads to polarisation in public debate. We've seen the rise of online activism and even of governments commentating and sharing their policies on Twitter, which is something that was unthinkable even a few years ago. And of course, there's the spread of misinformation and disinformation, which can be so damaging to organisations and the speed at which all this stuff happens across the globe. And this really is our new normal. This is what we're having to deal with. So I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at some of these behaviours, and then I'll look at their impact on crisis management. So understanding this new behaviour really starts by looking at the relationship between organisations and people. And I've worked with a fantastic business psychologist called Jill Green, who talks about the relationships that individuals have with organisations as a psychological contract. She says that when we buy from organisations, we have a sense of emotional ownership. We buy from them, and in return, we believe that they will behave in a certain way. But when an organisation breaks that contract, we feel betrayed and we lose trust in it. And there are a number of things that psychologists say that an organisation might do to break that contract, which in turn leads to negative behaviour from people. So the first thing that an organisation might do in order to create a crisis is do something that hits at people's core beliefs and values. So those are the things that people believe in personally with real passion. So for example, that might be tackling climate change, or it might be animal rights, or even veganism, for example, big movements. The second is it attacks our social norms. So what our wider network in society deems to be acceptable. So that might mean more corporate scandals, for example, or not meeting standards of animal welfare. The third is that the organisation might take away our control. So that particularly is relevant on things like data breaches. It's something that breaches the organisation's trust from its consumers. The next is it might hurt something or somebody we relate to. So if you live in a farming community, for example, you're going to care much more about an issue like welfare or an outbreak of disease than perhaps you would if you were living in a city. And even though it might not personally affect you, it affects people you care about, and therefore that also creates that trust break. And then finally, we might turn on an organisation if it goes against its own ethics or values. So for example, if an organisation says it invests in animal welfare or looking after its workforce, and it's then found to be abusing those standards, people will then turn against it. And these really are the 5 things that a good crisis plan should be built on. How do you avoid the most serious crisis in the first place, or how do you mitigate the risk? And often this is about acting in line with your values. We talk about brand dissonance. So is there a gap between what you say and what you do? And dissonance is really the disconnect between what people want or expect from your organisation and then how you actually behave. And that dissonance creates this tension and anger, and even a sense that you might have betrayed the people who trusted you. And that tends to be when people turn on you, particularly on social media. Now, we see extreme polarisation in all the difficult discussions that people care deeply about and how they play out online and on social media. And I often talk when I'm training about the outrage cycle. So on social media, a pattern of outrage might look like this. So somebody posts something publicly or says something publicly that outrages a group of people. Let's call them crowd B. But if you wait a little bit, a new crowd C, will also join in the debate. And these are people who are outraged at that first response of crowd B. So the result here is this polarization of opinion and debate. And that means at the moment, every protest has a counter protest. And that can be really exhausting if you're trying to manage a crisis in this kind of environment. I couldn't talk about crisis management without mentioning the spread of misinformation. And the European Health Chief was reported in 2019 as saying that fake news or misinformation can seriously damage citizens' trust in food systems and in science in general. And this is a huge problem in every industry, but perhaps particularly in this industry. But why do people how do they assess whether to believe information? Well, according to the American Psychological Association, there are 5 core steps that people go through to ascertain whether information is true or not. First, they check whether that information is compatible with other information that's available to them. Then they might ascertain whether they believe the source is credible. And then, and this is really critical in a social media context, they will look at whether other people believe it. They look for consistency, and then they look for supporting information. So if misinformation appears to be valid under these criteria, people will believe it to be true. And so, for example, if a site looks to be credible and it quotes somebody who might look as though they're a scientist, we're more likely to believe it. And of course, we're more likely to believe things that are shared on social media because we think other people believe them as well. But there's also something else going on here. We're much more susceptible to information which aligns with our own values and our own political beliefs and ideologies as well. So I'm going to look now at how you manage all of this stuff. Well, all the hard work really starts before the crisis hits. And we know now that organisations who'd invested in crisis or continuity planning before the pandemic, for example, were much better equipped to deal with it, of course. And this really starts with scenario planning. So the very first step any organisation should take is to look at what are the big issues that could disrupt your business tomorrow or in the future. And broadly, you can categorise those in three ways. The first is to look at movements. So the kind of big things that society is looking at. So the climate crisis, for example, environmental considerations, activism, those kind of big social movements. Then you can look at things within your market. So that might be supply chain issues or transportation problems. And then finally, things within your business. So that could be outbreaks of disease or welfare or data breach, for example. And once you understand those risk factors, you can create a crisis plan that's appropriate to address each of them. Now, good crisis management takes really great leadership to steer the organisation through these difficult times to the other side. And the most important thing leaders can do in a crisis is to make difficult decisions. And often that is done without actually knowing all the facts. And their job is to bring clarity to chaos. It's to set the course for the business to recover. And of course, to lead by example, setting the standards for behaviour through the crisis. But before all of that, the leader must define what crisis expert Jonathan Hemus calls the strategic intent of the business in managing the situation. Jonathan Hemus's advice is to imagine you're 6 months into the future. What would you want people to say about what happened and how you handled that crisis? And his advice is for leaders to write a very simple, clear, single sentence, what you want the outcome of that crisis to be. And that intent will focus all your efforts and your team efforts, and it'll make decision-making much easier, for example, because you can evaluate all the decisions you make against that single strategic intent. And that means your team will know what to do because they know how you want the business to behave and what you want it to achieve. And once you know your intent, of course, it's then time to tackle the crisis itself. So I have 6 core principles of crisis communication. The first is to start with your values. Always behave in line with your values. It's very typical for an organisation to forget its values in a crisis, but really, really behave in line with them. The second is to tell the truth. Again, it's tempting to try and cover up information, but never do that because you will get found out, especially in these days of social media. And tell people regularly what's going on and what you're doing to fix the problem, and that will stop them feeling anxious and afraid. Everything you should do should be to build trust, and trust is a really precious commodity during a crisis. It's quite a rare thing.
Kate, I hope you're hearing me. Can we jump please to the conclusions because we are out of.
Of course we can. Of course, that's absolutely fine. So I will talk now about setting the course for recovery because I think this is really important. So a recovery plan is all about building. A professor at Queensland Business School, and there are 6 key things here which I'll run through really quickly. The first is to make sense of what's happened and establish what went wrong to stop it happening again. The second is to make amends. So that might be a public apology, for example, or offering compensation, and that will mean that the anger against the organisation will subside. Then if you're seen to be adopting very high standards, building an ethical culture and being transparent and accountable, all those things will help you rebuild trust after the organisation. And if you do all of that successfully, then a crisis can be a really good way to reinforce your values and your positive behaviour and to support your people and your customers. So I'm going to leave you with a short quote from Albert Einstein, which is that in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. So that is my conclusion from today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for your presentation. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I had to interrupt, but the conclusions were clear enough for everybody. And anybody who didn't follow, just a reminder, everything is recorded and everything will put on the websites of what publication and Poultry Middle East. So you can follow it up, you can see all the details of the crisis management.